Well, let's just get started. Why don't you, thank you, by the way, for both doing the podcast together. Is this the first you've been on a show together?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, we've each done separate interviews, but we've never done one together. So we thought, oh, this could be fun.
Yeah.
All right. Well, why don't we just start off telling the audience a little bit about who you both are, your background. Of course, I have my copy of Perdurabo right here, an excellent book.
Awesome.
I've been a fan of that book since it came out. But
Thank
yeah,
you.
yeah. You introduce yourself to the audience.
Oh, go ahead, Richard.
Okay. Well, my name is Richard Kaczynski. As Jason mentioned, I am the author of Perdurabo, The Life of Aleister Crowley, and various other books in the Western esoteric tradition, including books like Forgotten Templars, The Untold Origins of Ordo Templi Orientis, The Wiser Concise Guide to Aleister Crowley, a critical edition of Aleister Crowley's The Sword of Song, and most recently from Oxford University Press, the book Friendship and Doubt, which looks at Aleister Crowley, J.F.C. Fuller, Victor Neuburg, and British agnosticism.
Here it is.
I would love to get into that later on in the podcast because Fuller is a bizarre and interesting character.
For sure.
Yeah, that's good. That'll be interesting. Yes, so sorry to interrupt.
Oh, no worries. Yeah, thank you for the great intro, Richard. Hey everyone, my name is Lynn, or Mavius Lynn, and I am a writer, artist, practicing occultist. So a lot of my work gets rather academic, but I am a practitioner as well. I've been published twice now in two different magazines, so that was a real honor. And I'm very active in my local pagan community, as well as my local Thelemic and occult community, where I teach classes and spread educational content. I also travel and do some teaching through various conventions as well. And of course, the particular area of my focus is Thelema in terms of that. But my practice and special interests are not confined to Thelema, but that generally tends to be what I talk about and teach.
I understand completely. When people meet, they expect me to just be running around in a robe or something, and I was like, "Oh no, that's just one. That's one of my 100 special interests. Let me introduce you to all the other ones."
Mhm.
And
I think that's a good thing too. I mean, people can get very focused on just the one thing, but actually like being a rounded individual and having a variety of interests is a good thing.
talk about that because you both seem like a pretty grounded couple and like grounded people. So
I hope so. I do my best.
you definitely do. And let's just start off on what you just said, Richard, because what for both of you constitutes a well-balanced, well-rounded, and grounded magician? And what does that actually mean in real world terms? Because I think that's something that actually we all can get fuzzy on from time to time.
Yeah, I guess my what comes to mind for me is being in academia and going to a party, an academic party, for one of my faculty members was throwing, and everyone got together and they were just talking shop the whole time. I just thought, y'all are so boring. I love these people, I work with them, but you think in your time off you might talk about something else. And I just have a wide variety of interests. While I've been interested in Magick and Thelema my whole life. I mean, I'm also a musician. I like listening to music. I'm a big fan of science fiction and fantasy literature. I grew up on Marvel comics, and so seeing all the MCU happening is pretty exciting. But I don't know, most things I can find some angle of interest in. I feel like being able to just have like a normal conversation with people is kind of the hallmark of being a well-rounded person. So it doesn't have to be talking about magic all the time. There are other things in life that one can converse about.
I think that's fantastic, Rick. I think for me personally, my mind comes back to that great quote by Crowley, which is success is your proof. And within that context, it's really asking the question, is it working? Is my current lifestyle, my interests, my hobbies, every facet of your life balanced enough so that you can do your will once you know it. And if you are out of balance and something's not working out, I think there are lots of things, lots of roadblocks, lots of feedback the world will give you to knock you back on course, so to speak. A huge part of my personal practice is actually yoga, and that forces me to return back to a place where I am consciously assessing my actions, my thoughts, how I'm moving through the world. It's not just, did I do that ritual really cool, and do I do all the cool hobbies and check off the list, you know? It's not a list to check off. It's an ongoing conversation with yourself, mentally, physically, but also your place in the world, and listening to the feedback the world is giving you, and listening to yourself, and making sure that you are doing your will in a way that's constructive and you are able to go forward. You know, for example, being mindful of how your language and your words around others impacts those. I've always viewed other people as a beautiful gift in our lives, whether it's friends or family, and a beautiful resource as well. I learned so much. I'm nourished as a human being by those in my life. And if I were to just lash out at people and be angry and be super aggressive, then I would, quite frankly, wither that resource. I would hurt those around me, and lose that connection, because they are a part of my trajectory forward in my will. So that's just one example of, I think, how magicians can become unbalanced in particular.
Okay. And how do you both define what will is? Since you brought it up.
Well, I think for me, and as the elevator pitch sort of sense,
I think the audience probably knows the elevator pitch. So I want to know the elevator pitch too. I don't want to cut you off, but I want to know the real answer from lived experience as well.
Well, I guess I would say I'd like to start with the elevator pitch.
Yes,
I think it's also my lived experience is that one, for me, I guess my true will is, if I stop doing everything that I'm doing in my life, what's the one thing I cannot not do? You know, the thing that I have to do, you know, if you want to take away everything else. And for me, that's, you know, what bubbles up to the surface every time is the writing. You know, for me, that's something from the time I was a child, I've always wanted to do. And it's the thing I keep coming back to. And it's something I've recognized as being just the core of my being. And that's where I put my energy and my effort to, you know, kind of fulfill who I am, and which I guess kind of comes back to that idea of will. It's this kind of being in touch with your real nature and honoring that and expressing that and focusing on, you know, realizing that to the best of your potential.
Are you, sorry, go ahead.
Oh, I was just going to say, to sort of piggyback on that, I'd imagine I'd say a lot of the same thing, but for me, it's returning back. For me, true will is this innermost spark of divinity that I seek to align myself and my path with. And for me, a great way to think about it is, as sort of Richard was saying, but in a different way, in my own way, and it's that which is left over when everything is taken away. So as human beings navigating through the world, we are faced with continual loss, tragedy, all of these things that challenge us. And I certainly have in my own life, in my own way, as I'm sure a lot of people could relate to. But when we've lost everything, what is left over? When we've shed all of that external stuff, we're left with ourselves.
I think that's a really practical and helpful definition. The kind of the subtractive. So that suggests that you know, that suggests a philosophic framework where people come in with already having a will, which already presumes a whole lot of other metaphysical stuff, like they came from somewhere, for instance, and what was going on there. But am I right in that you would define will as something that we come prepackaged with?
Well, I'll say this. I think there is perhaps some thread hard baked into that which is human, right? So humans don't spontaneously generate in the world. We've sort of moved past this idea of spontaneous generation. But that being said, I think for me to cling tightly to any kind of hard and fast notion would be doing myself a disservice and doing myself a disservice in seeking divinity in my path spiritually, which sounds like a really woo-woo response. But I truly believe that the harder I become in thinking I know the way things are supposed to work, and thinking I know the nature of divinity, and thinking I know myself, the harder that nut is, I think the more that closes myself off to experiences and understanding. And so I personally, when I approach spiritual work in general, so for example, I'm currently in the process of scrying the 30 Enochian Aethers, and doing that sort of Enochian work. If I were to come into that with hard ideas of what Enochian angels are, I think I would not allow myself to experience what it was supposed to be. So that is to say, I don't fully know, because I'm still alive. I am not dead yet. I am not, I don't know what happens after. I don't know what happens before. And I live with that uncertainty quite comfortably, because I think it's quite beautiful and it allows me potential to experience new things.
We may all.
I can piggyback.
Go ahead.
If I could piggyback off of that too, I think there's different ways you could approach the concept of will in Thelema, and one of these is this idea of some sort of divinity or plan that you're born into this world with a place in the big machine of the cosmos, and that when by doing your will, you're aligning yourself with the cosmic will and you're fulfilling your purpose in the grand design, which again in some ways implies a grand designer, but you can just as easily conceive of true will as I am a bundle of DNA and human experiences, nature and nurture, and I, as kind of a unique combination of these things that make up a human being, am just discovering myself and who I am and being true to my individual unique nature, and that doesn't necessarily involve the metaphysical apparatus of the divine plan or your true calling or what have you. And like Lynn was saying, there's I am also comfortable with this idea of uncertainty. It may be A, it may be B, and it doesn't really matter, because it's more of the act of doing and following my will that to me is the main thing, and the metaphysics behind it is ultimately unknowable. And I think that involves just kind of acknowledging that there are multiple possible explanations for what's going on, and just being okay with that. I'm a statistician, so I'm very comfortable with the idea that things exist probabilistically, but not necessarily with any certainty.
That for me is one of the most important things about Crowley, and of course how he was interpreted by Bob Wilson and people like that. And that's something that is completely lost, not just in religion and magic, but in the modern world. Like people are not okay with uncertainty anymore, and they want things to be black and white, which is unfortunate. So, which is a long way of saying it's refreshing to have an uncertain conversation.
Yeah, I mean, I find that kind of being involved in Ordo Templi Orientis, I find that people who come to that organization, sometimes, I know you want to say often, but sometimes are people who have come from, they're like recovering Catholics or something, and they're getting away from organized religion, but because they're coming from that framework, they're looking for someone to tell them what to think and what to do and what to follow. And in OTO, it's just gonna be kind of like, no, we're here to kind of support you in you finding out for yourself who you are and finding your best path. And we're all here to support each other, but we're not here to tell you what to do. And sometimes what happens is people go, well, heck, I'm going to go over here and find this other teacher who will tell me what to think. And I think this idea of uncertainty is hard for some people.
Have you ever read? Go ahead.
Do we have a moment for a quick David Lynch quote that I absolutely love?
Yes.
All right. So this is one of my favorites pertaining to this, and it's that when people grow, and I'm paraphrasing because it's off the top of my head, but when people grow up, they think they understand the way the world works, but in reality, they just experience a limiting of the imagination.
Yeah, I guess I would also just jump in and say that kind of on that similar train of thought, is I recently read a study in a psychological journal that talked about how in ages past, having a sort of a nuanced view of things was considered, a person with those sorts of views was considered to be kind of knowledgeable and as perceived as someone who has looked deeply into a matter and kind of collected all the facts. But we're now living in a time that's so very polarized that people who are trying to have a nuanced view of something tend to be ostracized by people on both extremes of any point of view.
Yeah, let's just focus straight on that, because I don't do organized groups anymore, but I used to do them a lot. I joined a whole lot to run around like a proper chaos magician and learn as much as I could. And one of the things I really miss about that world, whatever we want to call it, the paramasonic world, and that I particularly I never joined the OTO, but I used to go to Gnostic masses in LA a lot. And I am a Thelemite. So, but one thing, not about Thelema specifically, but one thing that I always really appreciated about the OTO is, first of all, people are really smart and have a lot of really interesting things that they're into, but also that sense of not just wanting more, wanting the truth in this banal sense, but really wanting to be outside of that polarization and occupying like a zone of frankly, very rebellious intellect. And I was always shocked, and I was increasingly shocked as time went on, how much that energy has vanished from the culture. Like, you really can only find that. Like, sometimes, like, you go to, secret society meetings, things like that, and it's like, even the fact that people are voracious readers, like they're reading all this stuff, they're reading old books, they're reading classics, that's like an occult thing now. Like, I don't see that. Like, I see that when you know what I mean? Occult as in hidden. It's like almost that, people being active readers and, to that caliber, like that's pretty occult these days. So.
Yeah.
Not as that was much a question. It was reminiscent.
Yeah, no, my brain is just trying to kind of catching up on that. I mean, I love having my preconceptions challenged and finding a point of view that is contrary to my own. What I think of, one of my favorite intellectual exercises is kind of picking up some sort of a theory or a school of thought, whether it be Freud or Jung or sociobiology or something. I'm using psychology examples because I'm a psychologist by training, but just, trying on like a pair of clothes, a particular perspective or viewpoint and saying, well, how far can we go with this? How much, can sociobiology actually explain? It doesn't necessarily mean that I'm agreeing with it, but it's just, to me, the intellectual exercise of saying how much can you wring out of this? How much explanatory power does this point of view have? Is great, and again, having evidence presented to me that kind of makes me question my own assumptions and taking a step back and reevaluating what I know. I mean, that's exhilarating to me. So I guess I would kind of that's the first thing that what you said kind of prompted.
I mean, my mind goes to a lot of my experience. Whoa, a lot of my experience with free thought. So I think this is an interesting little side note because it's also how Richard and I kind of met, or at least like wrapped up in that story. But back when, my start into the occult and like the path I'm currently on really began back when I was in middle school and to high school, just getting really into philosophy. And that translated into college, which of course philosophy led to getting into the occult, but in college that also meant getting into the free thought movement. And so I was heavily involved in that, and I actually served as the president of my local free thought society for 2 years.
What is free thought? I actually don't know. other than what it sounds like.
Yeah, so it's well, go ahead, Richard.
You're the president.
Oh, thank you. So it's a movement that has historical ties into movements of questioning overarching dogma in society. So that could be political, that could be spiritual or religious dogma, social, cultural norms. So it's this idea of arriving at this place of thinking about things more in a more reasonable sort of intellectual way, intellectually curious way. And so Richard actually recently wrote a book all about this, exploring the historical roots of that, which we will come back to, because I kind of want to focus, just get this story out, because I think it might help people think about how we have conversations and what's a good way to have conversation. Because also as a local community organizer now, so I started off young doing community organizing and this free thought, and now I'm an organizer on occult spaces, not only in person through the pagan community, but also OTO, where I serve as a local officer, but also my own study groups I run on the internet through Discord and all of that fun stuff. But anyway, there's always this question of how do we have productive conversations, because people come to occult spaces or even discussion spaces with different things they want to get out of it. So I often see people in the occult, they come simply for support, and they're part of this community for support. They may be coming from a high control religion, they may be coming with some sort of trauma, whatever the case may be, they just want to be in a space where they're safe to be themselves. Then you have people on the other side of it coming to these spaces looking to be intellectually challenged, right? They want a little bit more fire to their conversation, and they want to get into it, and they want to get into ideas that are sometimes difficult to grapple with. Both are valid. And so when I was in the Free Thinkers, the way I handled this is I actually had 3 different discussion groups each meeting. And I didn't want to call them fast, medium, slow, because that sounded a little bit, I don't know, patronizing or disrespectful. So I chose animal names. So fast was cheetah, then there was, I think, horse, and then panda. So in the cheetah mode, anything goes. So that's where you take things to the pedantic extreme. You try to stretch philosophical ideas to their limits, right? And you just take things to absurd dimensions. And in that challenge, you just really break things down, and like a type of transformation and thought and understanding can take place. And that's so valuable. And that was also a space people could try on, like Richard was saying, different ideas that weren't their own. So you could take the devil's advocate approach, and people in the discussion group were expecting that. So no one's feelings were hurt. And then in the horse mode, it was more talking about your own ideas and your own feelings and your own perspective, but in a more nuanced, careful, considerate way. And then panda mode was people who were wanting to share in a less personal, safe, comfortable, extremely kind way. So people coming to that were just looking for someone, to have a coffee with and ask them how their day was, which is completely valid too. But anyway, sorry, I completely derailed it a little bit, but I hope that was helpful for our viewers and listeners today. But if you want to talk about friendship and doubt, that's a great opportunity.
Good segue, I suppose.
Yeah.
Before we move there, I think that's really valuable. And the thing about Magick is it's obviously very much about it can be very much about the individual, and it can be a very individualist and at times edgelordy path. So it's rare that you meet people who have experience organizing groups. And so that, just even that sounded really good.
Thank you.
And it makes a lot of sense just with social dynamics. But I'm curious, I definitely want to talk about friendship and doubt, but one of the reasons I'm curious about kind of this conversation going to maybe a meta level past just the concept of magic and to organizing. We could talk about your, social organizing, but also experiencing life as a magical couple is, and I'm very interested in, because it's a perspective that we hear a little bit more of now, but not much. And as the occult world grows, as I think it is, I think that's very healthy and helpful for people to have a model or information. So, in terms of that in a question, how did you two meet?
Oh yeah, yeah, absolutely. So, I guess I'll tell some of the story, which is interestingly enough ties back into friendship and doubt as well.
Okay.
But I actually people always assume I met Richard through the OTO, which was not the case. So fun fact. Oh, good, you brought it out. Fun fact, I was actually a published writer and had started my YouTube channel and was like doing all of this and joined the OTO without even knowing him. Of course, I knew in theory who he was because he's the author of Perdurabo. Who doesn't know Richard? If you're a Thelemite, you know who Richard Kaczynski is. But what happened is I really wanted a copy of this book, Sort of Song, um, which is
Very
completely sold
non,
out.
a very
And
non-controversial book. Nothing
yeah, and so
in there.
I I didn't have the money to like pre-order it and it was already sold out, but a friend of mine, Jean, saw that Richard was selling extra copies and I had money, so I jumped on it. I was like, hey, I would love to buy a copy from you. And then it turned out he was thinking about mailing me the book, and they're like, oh wow, we actually live in the same town, which both of us did not know. And so we're like, oh, okay, but we're also both vegetarians. That's interesting. So let's go meet up for sushi. And I didn't know Richard was single. Let's just put that out there. So I a book from him, and we just had such an amazing time. What turned out to be well, I was expecting just to be like, hi, nice to meet you. Can I interview you for my podcast? Turned into hours of conversation. He is such an amazing, interesting person to talk to.
Oh, likewise.
Oh, thank you. And then of course, it came out, he was writing another book called Friendship and Doubt, which is all about Aleister Crowley and agnosticism and free thought. And I had previously served as an officer in my free thought society, so that was wild.
Yeah, that seemed like the most unlikely coincidence. I mean, you would think in an occult space there are certain things that would be you would not be surprised to have some kind of a common interest. Oh, two vegetarians who are into magic. Okay, that happens. I know quite a lot of occultists who are also vegetarians, but free thought is such like a very unusual and specific thing that to have had that background is like wow. And yeah, so I kind of came into this just feeling guilty, saying I don't want to charge you $15 to FedEx a book across town. Let me just hand it to you and save you some money. And then we just started talking about, oh, what's a good occult movie? And I'd be like, oh, it was Angel Heart. And she's like, oh, I've never seen Angel Heart. And, oh my God, we've got to watch Angel Heart. It's like one of my favorite movies.
I love that. I love that. That's one of my favorite movies too. I love that. Robert.
Well,
Yeah.
and I think like another element to the story that I think is important that a lot of people listening are probably like, I want to know about that, is like how that initial bridge into like friendship to romance happened. And at first, so I basically just like moved in with Richard. I just like, no, I'm just kidding. No, I mean, I don't want to say obsessed with him, but like I very quickly was like, wow, this man is so interesting and just a bright soul in the world that I want to be close to all the time. So he was very kind to let me come over to his house a lot and like eat his food and read his books. And so we had that friendship going on, and I had no idea. Like, I did not know if I thought he was letting me do that because he felt sorry for me, because I didn't have any friends. But no, and he, to quote him, he was never going to make the first move. He would have went to his grave without telling me any feelings. And I was scared too, because I was like, what if I become this man's stalker? Like, I mean, of course I would have respected his boundaries and all of that, but like a part of me, it was a very slow kind of thing. A part of me was absolutely falling madly in love with him. How could I not? And I made the first move. I was like, I'm gonna go for it, and it's just gonna be what it is. And I'm very lucky that the story ended with it being mutual, and I'm not Richard Kaczynski's stalker. But yeah, yeah, he was just very aware, especially being in a higher degree than me in the OTO and everything. He was never gonna like make that happen, so I made that happen, and I'm very glad I did.
Yeah, I was just being aware of the the power differential there in terms of seniority and OTO and things like that, because we were both members, even though we didn't meet in that capacity, and I didn't want to be that guy, So.
Yeah.
Yeah, and I mean, it's interesting, even though we're both in the same fraternal order, like the things we do are very different. So we're technically under the same roof, but we're kind of do our own thing. We don't really do stuff together much in the OTO.
We attend things.
Yeah, we attend things. I take him to things that he otherwise would not be at. I aggressively make him do stuff.
I'm fine with it.
That's very good. That's always healthy. I need more of that too.
Yeah, it's good.
Especially after COVID, I feel like.
Yeah.
And normally introverted people kind of like went further introverted and didn't come out. What would you say that the unique benefits and challenges of having, I mean, there's 3 levels here, having not just a magical relationship, but a thelemic relationship. And then you've already touched on both being in the OTO, but specifically let's just talk about being a thelemic couple, if I can say that. What would you say the unique challenges and pluses are?
I don't know if I can think of any challenges. I guess I'll leave that to Lynn
That's
Mavius as I
so
speak.
sad.
No, it's.
And by the way, this doesn't have to be a personal question. It can be what you've observed in others, since you have large social circles.
Yeah. I mean, that's from my perspective, it's all been benefits. I mean, when you're, I don't know, I suppose with anything in life, but this is particularly true if you're a magician or, a Thelemite or what have you, it's that your spiritual work takes up a great deal of your time and energy. And if you're also participating in an organization, that's going to take up your time as well. And so to have a partner who is do the same things, that just opens up all that more opportunity for you to enjoy those things together and not be doing these things in isolation and having to struggle to find the times to be together. It just provides this opportunity for us to, even though our spiritual journeys are entirely our own, it also allows us to go on that journey side by side and enjoy those experiences together. Go to Thelema together, or take trips to give a presentation somewhere, or go to a Gnostic mass together, or what have you, or celebrate the Gnostic mass together. So that to me is just it's all benefits. I don't know if you want to add anything.
Yeah. So like I think there's like 2 things in my mind. There's like us personally, and then there's like things I've observed in the larger occult community. For us personally, it's been incredibly nourishing and beautiful, and I feel like the depth of our connection is so much more in that we share such a similar perspective on spirituality and religion, philosophy, all of that good stuff. We can take things a lot deeper, and I feel very seen in a way that you can absolutely feel seen in any kind of relationship with anyone, of course, but I think it's a new dimension to be with another Thelemite, and an absolute blessing to be with Richard in any capacity. So I admire him so much. He is truly such a radiant person who inspires everyone around him, and I feel so blessed to be near that light. And I to eat his food and read his books and bother him. And I think that it's important to remember that it's not just like we're Thelemites, but we're such similar people, because both of us are writers, some better than others. I'm just kidding. We write different things. Well, I guess we both write occult, but he writes more historical stuff. I write more like practitioner kind of perspective. But I think for me, a fun day together is us sitting near each other and just writing and researching and bouncing ideas off of each other, and then we watch a movie in at night, and that's fun for us. But I can imagine other people who have a very different lifestyle wouldn't like that kind of working so much.
Hmm.
But for me, it's not work; it's really play.
Yeah,
I love reading, I love writing, I love researching, and like to do it next to someone who's doing similar but slightly different. It's a joy beyond anything.
that's wonderful. You
And
go
yeah,
ahead.
go ahead. I can broaden it back up to like general observations if you want to.
Well, I wanted to
Yeah.
point to one thread in that. That was all beautiful. You meant that kind of there was something that sounded a bit like a relationship framework emerging from that, where it was the idea, I think Richard, you said, you're both on your spiritual journey and they're both different. I mean,
Mm,
particularly when you're doing magic or yoga or let alone Thelema, you're having a lot of intense internal experiences and you may be going through, depending on what time in your life it is and what you're practicing and how intense you may be going through really intense personal upheavals and shifts, like very intense ones. So I think you kind of pointed to this idea of you're both on your own journey, but you can do it next to each other. And I thought that was worth highlighting. And maybe if
yes.
you would say a bit more about that, because that sounds like an actual useful framework.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that, there's this idea I mentioned earlier that in like a fraternal organization like OTO, I mean, one of the things that offers is it doesn't tell you how to live your life or what you should do or what you should think, but kind of supports you in finding your own way to be, the best version of yourself. It's this relationship is like that on steroids. I mean, we are doing our own thing, but we are also supporting each other and being each other's biggest cheerleader. And there's also that sense to which we also overlap. When we were talking about Inoki and Magick, for instance. That's a thing that we're doing together. Where
Mm,
I'm doing the calls, and Lynn is doing this thing where she goes into the vision, and then while she's in the vision, kind of does a very quick watercolor of what she saw, and so we're kind of working through something and doing this. This sort of work together, and so
yeah. I
having those
need.
opportunities is to support each
Mm,
other.
That's great.
Is nice as well. I mean, I'll
I need to
bounce
say
ideas
something.
off of her. I'll pull out references. When she's working on something, and go, oh, you should look at this too. And but then seeing, I mean, I might like put a book in front of her face, but then to see, her read that and then what she does with it, and then put something, create something and write something that's in her own words and her own unique viewpoint. I mean, blows my mind every time. So it's
He has a really good library. I'm very blessed that I have
Excellent.
access to that. But I did want to say something really important, and because I do see as people publicly writing and doing stuff together, as Richard and I are, people do occasionally project stuff onto us, and specifically project weird things onto me. And I want to say this very explicitly. In Thelema, right out of her central sacred holy text, the Book of the Law, chapter 1, it says, "Every man and every woman is a star. Not men are stars and women are subservient to them." So this idea of equality is baked into our central philosophy and tenets right out of the Book of the Law. So for Richard and I am not subservient to him in a relationship. Richard is not the magician and I'm like his helper. That's not what our dynamic at all. We are both magicians and we are at equal places in our relationship. Our work overlaps, like Richard said, and that's a beautiful thing. But my work is still my own. Richard's work is still his own. And again, we are both magicians in our own right, doing our own work. And I think it's really beautiful. This is actually like we talked about earlier, our first time doing like a podcast together, because I'm very mindful of my work not being interpreted as just simply being Richard's helper. And I get those comments a lot that like I'm doing this work in service to Richard. And I really want to emphasize the fact that this work started before Richard. I am also a magician, And I think that's one of the beautiful things about Thelema and this magical current is we both stand on our own, and that brings a special kind of force and fire to the work, but also our mundane lives and how our relationship plays out.
Thank you for pointing that out. Yeah, that is, how would you, so you, just because you brought up the bit about mundane lives, how does that play out? How do you feel that that changes the work and your day-to-day experience coming at it from that viewpoint, which is wonderful. Thank you for elaborating that for people.
Well, I think, for example, when we we don't subscribe to this model that like there's like gender imbalance, you know, like the man's work is this and the woman's work is this. Like that's not how we function. We approach things as equal partners. So Richard cooks, I cook. Richard cleans, I clean. So there's it's not necessarily that like one person's doing everything, as much as we go about tasks in a more rational kind of like, all right, who has time to do this? What makes sense? For example, I love to garden. One of my special interests outside of the occult is actually gardening and plants and growing veggies, and I love animals too, but that's a whole other thing. But anyways, so like I typically am the one who likes to get out there in the yard and do the yard work because I like to do it and I think I'm pretty good at it. And then sometimes there's not enough time to do the yard work, and Richard does it.
Badly.
No, he gets really frustrated when he does it. Yeah, I think so. Our Thelemic house, I mean, Thelema looks as diverse as the individuals doing it, right? I mean, but I think like our household is one of egalitarianism and assigning tasks according to interest and ability.
Well, I just think like there was a time we were doing the HelloFresh thing, and Lynn was loving like preparing the meals.
Oh yeah, I used to do
well,
yeah. Those are
if you do the cooking, I'm going to clean up everything afterwards, and that worked out fine. So it's again just a kind of a equitable division there.
That's great. That's great. Okay, well let's talk about friendship in doubt. You've been waiting.
Woohoo!
Give us the elevator pitch.
Okay, well, Friendship in Doubt is the first book that actually looks at the role of agnosticism and free thought in bringing together Aleister Crowley, J.F.C. Fuller, and Victor Neuburg, who were the kind of the foundational members of the new religious movement of Thelema, and it looks at how that influenced the development of that new religious movement and how they carried all that with them into the rest of their lives, even after their friendships, went their separate ways. And just to kind of double back to our earlier conversation about what is free thought, I guess I would say that the idea here of agnosticism and free thought in the British era was this idea of taking religion out of politics, out of our social lives, out of the lawmaking process, and that the things that happen in society should be governed not by someone's particular religious beliefs, but by scientific evidence and facts. And so there's that idea of questioning these underpinnings of society, which in many cases were bound up in biblical belief, and trying to supplant that and replace it with evidence and facts.
Okay, so for those who don't know, I think Crowley's somewhat of a known quantity, but explain who Victor Neuburg and J.F.C. Fuller were.
All right. Well, Victor Neuburg was a poet who Crowley looked up because of some of the poetry he was publishing in the Gnostic Journal at that time suggested a gift or an affinity for astral projection. And Victor Neuburg then became one of Crowley's students, the first student in the AA system, kind of the successor to the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn that Crowley was one of the founders of. And also they became lovers and so on. after that, again, kind of fell apart. Victor Neuburg went on his way to create a little indie, bespoke printing press called the Vine Press and so on. And later, as the poetry editor for the Daily Mirror, I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the exact newspaper he worked for at the time, but he basically discovered Dylan Thomas. J.F.C. Fuller was a military figure who was one of the three signatories or founders of the AA movement I mentioned. And he, again, came from this free thought and skeptical background, found Crowley through these journals, became very devoted, but once Crowley became sort of publicly notorious, J.F.C. Fuller feared what impact that connection might have for his military career, and kind of just, ghosted Crowley basically. But privately continued to follow his writings and collect all of his books and so on, and went on to become a quite distinguished military person, made the rank of Major General. Had the notoriety of embracing fascism and being invited to Adolf Hitler's 50th birthday party. So not cool in my book, but from that standpoint. But the interesting thing about Fuller is that at the end of his life, when he sold off his collection of Crowleyana, just had nothing but high praise for Crowley, saying that some of his poetry was amongst the best in the English language and up there with some of the greats, and some, in French and other languages as well. So the idea that he could kind of ghost Crowley and kind of keep him at his arm's length distance for his military career, but nevertheless harbor this profound sort of respect for him, I thought to be very interesting.
Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about, because of the war in Ukraine, I've been thinking a lot about Fuller, just the fact that Crowley, in more or less this time period, was connected with Fuller, who, in my understanding, invented blitzkrieg warfare, which is more or less responsible for so much of the destruction that Germany was able to wreak across Europe, and also was friends with Walter Duranty, who then went to Ukraine and was an apologetic for Stalinism in the New York Times. Which also led to quite a lot of carnage. And I've just been thinking, this is such a bizarre period of time. And, and then you get Vision and the Voice in the middle of that, which in my opinion is Crowley's best work, and is profound. But yeah, he was hanging out with some interesting people. And the fact that those two went on to be so involved with the force and fire, like the true destruction and force and fire was to come, is something that I've thought about. I don't know if you have any insights into that.
Yeah, I mean, Crowley actually knew a surprising number of military people. The Rites of Lucis, for instance, this series of 7 plays for each of the planets in traditional astrology, was originally came out of a ritual, a demonstration of Veredo Bartzabel at the house of Commander G.M. Marston, in the military, that there are just all kinds of connections that Crowley has. And when you start to look at Crowley from this idea that he had intelligence connections as well during when he was in the United States, he reported on his own recognizance to Commander Guy Gaunt, who was the British attaché to the United States. And so there's this idea that Crowley was actually involved in British intelligence that kind of explains why he had all these military connections.
Yeah. Okay. What do you think of Richard Spence's idea that Crowley was responsible for sinking the Lusitania in the lead up to World War One? That's a total tangent.
Yeah, I'm not sure about that. I mean, the interesting thing about Spence's book, and to his credit, he says this right up front, as he says, there is some stuff in this book that we have definite evidence for, we know is true. There is stuff in here that is likely true, but there's stuff in here that's kind of speculative. And for me, some of the speculative stuff is, Crowley was in New York City at the same time as this other spy was in New York City, so they may have known each other. And it's like, yeah, who knows? And so while there's certainly evidence that Crowley was involved in the intelligence operations, there's some of the claims in the book I do take with a grain of salt, because it kind of falls into that more probably or maybe or speculative area. So as the statistician, I'm happy to live with uncertainty and kind of say, I buy this one,
Yeah.
odds are probably not. So
Crowley's intelligence connections are always a point of fascination and mystery. I actually worked on that book because I was working at Feral House at the time, and I've had Richard Spence on this podcast, and he had a lot of really interesting things to say. But he was also convinced that Jack Parsons was a Russian agent, which like a communist agent, which I can't really see, given his libertarian bent. But yeah.
Yeah, that's. I know there was some concern that he may have been an Israeli agent, because there was some intention that once his career basically in the U.S. was shut down by the McCarthyism, the idea that his interests, his early interests in communism, but also just his interest in the occult and all of that, led to his loss of security clearance, and therefore being basically kicked off of the companies that he has helped founded, like JPL. He was looking to relocate to Israel and just kind of be involved in their rocketry program, but before he could move, his workshop blew up. Yeah.
Well, just to bring it back to Fuller, because Fuller, since Neuberg's already had a biography of him with the Gene Overton Fuller one, Parsons has had a couple and a TV show. Fuller, you don't hear people talk about very much, and he's one of the most interesting ones, in my opinion. And so let me just give you an outline of what I know about him, and please correct everything or fill in the blanks, if you will, the gaps. From my understanding, he was clearly enamored with Crowley at the beginning, copying his writing style, and things like Star in the West and the stuff that he wrote for the Equinox. And then he broke with Crowley. I think, if I'm remembering correctly, it was because of Crowley's bisexuality and potentially his involvement with Neuberg, and that came to light in the trial. He didn't want to be associated with that. Is all that about right so far?
Yeah, I mean, the aforementioned rites of Aloysius was an event that drew the attention of the London tabloids, that tried to discredit Crowley as starting some pagan religion. And one of the accusations that the press leveled was that George Cecil Jones, who was one of the co-founders of the AA, was Crowley's lover, and George Cecil Jones sued the paper for printing that lie. And
that was not true.
Not to my knowledge.
Okay. I don't know. All right.
I mean, Crowley was bisexual and queer, so it's anything's possible. But Jones certainly denied it. He was married and had kids and a family and a reputation, and he objected to this and went to trial. And neither Jones nor the Looking Glass newspaper called Crowley as a witness, kind of curiously. And Fuller was a bit taken aback that Crowley didn't volunteer to be a witness, and that had something to do with it. So I don't know if it's so much the bisexuality as it was Fuller not wanting his name to get dragged into the press in connection with Crowley in some way, because you felt that would be a career killer. And the thing is, the upshot of that court case, I think, kind of speaks to that issue, is that the case was dismissed, and the judge decided that regardless of whether what they wrote was true or not, that Jones basically deserved what he got for hanging out with such a notorious character as Aleister Crowley. So I think that was like, whoa, if you hang out with Crowley, people can say whatever they want about you. Is kind of the upshot of that case, kind of amazingly enough.
It's interesting that, yeah, right, that it's continued. I think it's interesting that that's interesting given what later happened with Fuller, where he more, if I mean, I don't know about the exact legal definition, but he essentially committed treason against the UK and going to work with Hitler and bringing them military information, and then also became involved with Oswald Mosley and the British Union of Fascists, which is if you don't want your name dragged into the mud, that's kind of odd behavior for somebody in the middle of a war,
Yeah, well, that was the thing, that actually was the connection that kind of had this Crowley stuff brought up. In fact, that he was involved with Mosley and the British Union of Fascists, and then a competing fascist group that published a newspaper called The Fascist actually rediscovered his connections to Crowley and kind of plastered it in their newsletter as a front page story. And Fuller was actually preparing to sue these people for publishing this stuff, and he was counseled, no one reads this crap, it's just, but if you make a big deal out of it, you're just going to draw attention to this. So he just kind of let the story kind of die rather than drawing attention to it. So, but yeah, so it's that's how the Crowley stuff came to haunt him, in 1936, 25 years later.
Yeah, it's odd also that one thing that has baffled me about Fuller is that even despite the fact that he was involved with Hitler and was boosting Mosley, he never lost his military rank. They didn't promote him when they probably did all of the other same people of his status and rank and age. He was never promoted, but they didn't kick him out of the military. I don't think they took any type of security clearance away from him. Despite
there were other people who were involved in those sorts of things that did experience more discipline. The one kind of oversight that Fuller did experience was that when World War II started, a lot of retired military personnel were called back up to help with the war, and he was overlooked for that. So there certainly were some sort of professional repercussions because of that.
Seems kind of like
not as severe as some.
It seems a little like a slap on the wrist, which raises questions. I mean, you think he would have come in for more disciplinary action, as he put it. One wonders what was going on there. So let's talk about Victor Neuburg, because he's been written about his relationship with Crowley is iconic. Their working in the desert is, and in the 10th Aether is iconic. So he's one that is more broadly known, but usually just as a kind of like a supporting character in Crowley's play is how people see him. So talk about Neuburg and what your impression was of him coming out of your research for this book.
Yeah, I think one of the things that comes out in Friendship and Doubt is this idea that challenges the typical narrative that Jean Overton Fuller took in her book, The Magical Dilemma of Victor Neuburg. And Jean Overton Fuller was unrelated to J.F.C. Fuller, but she paints this picture of Neuburg being this, shattered, hollowed out shell of a man after Crowley was done with them, and he, was never the same, and that he hid under his desk the rest of his life for fear that Crowley would knock on his door at some point. And the fact of the matter is, in the later years, when Crowley signed on to the Mandrake Press to publish some of his works, they put out this book called The Legend of Aleister Crowley, where the editor, Pierre Stevenson, collected Crowley's press clippings, basically, reviews of his poetry and so on, but also documented this sort of systematic attack in his character and the kind of the destroying of his reputation, calling it a campaign of vilification, unseen in modern times. And when that book came out, Victor Neuburg wound up reviewing it for the Freethinker magazine, saying that this is true. Crowley was, had a lot to say, and he's worth checking out. And then when, a year later, Magick and Theory and Practice came out, Victor Neuburg once again, wrote for, the newspaper he was working for, did a review of Magick and Theory and Practice, saying that, Aleister Crowley may not be a nice man to know, but his teachings on magic are very valuable and are worth, looking at. So that does not sound like the behavior of someone who is hiding in fear that Crowley might knock on his door someday. So I think kind of setting kind of that story to rest. I mean, I kind of feel like Gene Overton Fuller had a great deal of fondness for Victor Neuburg and kind of had this, transferred some outrage on Victor Neuburg's behalf onto Crowley and kind of painted this kind of exaggerated picture. And I just kind of hope that by sharing some of this information, Victor Neuburg, some of Victor Neuburg's autonomy is kind of restored.
And I just wanted to add too, I think that's one of the unique things about Friendship and Doubt and Richard's work is that Victor Neuburg really is painted as a whole human being and gets a voice through this work in a way that hasn't really been done before.
Yeah. Well, the thing is, Victor Neuburg's biography, Magick of Thelema, Victor Neuburg, was published in the 60s. And there were 2 J.F.C. Fuller biographies published, but those were
I didn't even realize
in the 70s.
I didn't even realize there were bios of J.F.C. Fuller.
Yeah, there's one called J.F.C. Fuller, Military Strategist, and another one was called Boney Fuller, I believe. But those both came out in the 70s. The funny thing is, though, they completely skirt this issue of, I mean, they're not completely, but they give very, very, very little space to the occult and magical stuff. It's kind of like they kind of, that, and maybe the publishers are part of this, but I think the people who are writing this are more interested in Fuller as a military person, not as an occultist. And I think that also happens to sit fine with his estate, who kind of wants to focus on that. And, I don't want to put words in their mouth, but there just hasn't been a whole lot of attention paid to Fuller's occult leanings. And, for, a distinguished military person that may be fine with, the people who are trying to carry on his name, I'm kind of hoping that this book being published for Oxford University Press kind of legitimizes asking these questions about Fuller and kind of saying, hey, here's where his head was at when he was just getting started in his first writings. And you can then kind of graph this, and kind of see where his thinking evolved from this very early stage. So I think it's valuable, and maybe it will, allow other people to kind of ask some more questions and look a little bit farther into, the trajectory of J.F.C. Fuller's career and his thinking.
Right. If I remember correctly, I mean, he was still writing books about Kabbalah late in his life, and he had military theories based on Kabbalah, which is pretty wild.
Yeah. I do get into that in the book as well.
Yeah, I think the image that most people know about Victor Neuburg, just maybe a few snippets, is the desert in Algeria, and then there's, of course, the story of him in Atlantis bookshops, and Crowley comes in, and he's hiding and terrified that Crowley's there. But who was he really? And you said a more full version of him as a human being emerged.
Yeah, Victor Neuburg was born to a rather wealthy family who imported rattans and more goods from the Far East. His father abandoned the family when he was still pretty young, and so he was raised by his mom and aunts. He was a sensitive child. He became a vegetarian while he was still in grade school, and had this interest in poetry. And one day, stopping by one of the local high street bookshops, he came across a copy of the Freethinker magazine, and that kind of set the tone. His first contribution to the literature was a poem called Wale Yehovah, whereas basically, as I kind of jokingly say, the title of that is Latin for "See ya, God." It's him just kind of saying that he is, shrugging off all the baggage of his Jewish upbringing and, taking on the free thought movement. It's kind of interesting because there's a similar story with Fuller where he published this article in the Agnostic Journal, basically calling for the end of compulsory church attendance for military personnel. And even though Fuller was like 25 years old at this time, he begged his mom, "Don't show my dad," because his dad was a preacher, and he didn't want his dad to know that he was, experiencing this apostasy.
Yeah.
But Neuberg did the same sort of thing. And
So not to interrupt, but it sounds like Black Magician daddy issues are a tale older than time.
yeah. Well, I mean, I think that's something that holds true for all three of them, because, Crowley had the preacher dad who he actually kind of idolized and in many ways kind of wound up emulating, and that, he was the head of a very obscure religious group, and he traveled around handing the book of the law to anyone who would listen. So, not too different on the surface level. Although the beliefs behind both dad and son were quite different. But yeah, because Neuberg came from a wealthy family, one of his uncles paid for him to go to Trinity College, Cambridge, which was where Crowley went. And there he started the Cambridge University Free Thought Association. And the idea there was to kind of host talks as an opportunity for Crowley to come onto campus and give lectures and presumably recruit, bright young students into the AA group that he had started. And yeah, then he got all caught up in the magic that Crowley was doing, not only doing the vision, the voice stuff that we referred to earlier, but the Paris working and so on. And there was an incident where Neuberg was having an affair with one of the dancers from the Rites of Eleusis, and her husband winds up filing for divorce, naming Victor Neuburg in the suit, and the wife winds up committing suicide kind of on the heels of all of this. And that certainly was a blow to Victor Neuburg, and he goes very quiet for a few years after that. He's also in the military, serving at that time in World War I, comes out, and once again, his wealthy family kind of bails him out and says, "Oh, you want to do this poetry stuff? Here, we'll buy you a printing press. Here, you can go live in your aunt's cottage in Steyning and, publish, these hand press, books, for you and your friends," which is, what he did for the next decade before he began working for, carrying on his work in poetry and discovering poets through, the newspapers and, again, finding Dylan Thomas, but he actually wound up dying rather young, like age 40. So, his life, again, was kind of tragically cut short, but...
How did he die?
Gosh, I don't recall offhand, I'm sorry. I should know that.
Is it cancer or something?
Yeah, I don't want to venture a guess because I could be wrong.
So, talk about Neuberg as a magician then, outside of just Crowley's orbit. What do you think his own personal magical dilemma was, if you will?
That's kind of hard to say because, for a magician, if we don't have their diaries or their records, we don't really know what they were doing. And for Neuberg, I mean, what we know of his workings are things that we have, like we have his diary from when he was doing a retirement at Crowley's house, Boleskine. We have the vision, the voice, and we have the records of the Paris working, or the Rites of Eleusis, in which he was a dancer. I guess that was one of the things he did. He he would, go do this ecstatic sort of trance dance sort of thing. But after parting ways with Crowley, we don't really know. Perhaps somewhere in the family archives there's some evidence of whether he did or did not engage in magical practice. In terms of his published output, unlike Fuller, where he wrote quite explicitly about occult subjects, we don't see that happening with Neuberg's poetry so much. Those articles where he comes and defends the legend of Aleister Crowley or Magic and Theory and Practice in 1929, 1930. So that kind of stands out, that he would still have those opinions, they're favorable opinions. So one wonders, what practice, if any, he continued.
So, judging from the title of the book, it sounds like there may have been some type of triangle between, not necessarily romantic, but relationship triangle between Crowley, Neuberg, and Fuller. I'm curious what was happening there.
Yeah, I mean, I think the triangle was the agnosticism. I mean, that's literally how they wound up meeting.
Hence the pun, doubt. Friendship in doubt.
But also just that whole idea that their friendship was kind of short-lived, and so their friendship did fall into a period of doubt as well as the years went on. The short number of years they were friends. So yeah, a little bit of a double entendre there. But I mean, Crowley's works were being distributed by the Rationalist Press Association, which is how J.F.C. Fuller in India, where he was stationed at the military, learned of Crowley and this contest for the best essay on his works, and wrote to Crowley to participate in this contest. And that's how, Fuller met Crowley. And then Crowley read this poem from Victor Neuburg in that same journal, the Agnostic Journal, and sought him out. And, again, they met at the funeral of the editor of this journal. Crowley wanted to buy the magazine from his widow, and kind of turned it into his own magical occult journal. That didn't happen, so he started the Equinox, but it was this whole agnostic movement that brought them together, and these ideas of agnosticism and evidence-based approach to civics, basically, leads to these ideas of scientific illuminism that Crowley puts forth, the idea that you can do magic in a methodical and scientific way, and that the Equinox, had as on its masthead, the method of science, the aim of religion. But also just things like starting your own journal or starting your own publishing company, which is something that the agnostics were doing to great effect. So a lot of these things that Crowley, Fuller, and Neuberg did at this time were very much following the mold of what was established from their familiarity with the agnostic movement.
I did not know that at all. That's really interesting.
That's why the book's cool. No one's looked at it before, so there's these breadcrumbs there in his writings, but no one's actually connected the dots. Which was kind of the fun thing about a book like this, rather than doing something expansive like a biography. This is saying, let's look at one very specific thing and follow all the threads, through, and it's just gives us a very different perspective on things.
Would you say that in following those threads through, you came to any specific conclusions about your subject matter?
Well, primarily that the ideas of agnosticism and rationalism and free thought are kind of baked into the system from the very beginning. And I think having a greater appreciation of that has been very informative for me. And I hope it will be for others.
Yeah, and I think it's particularly interesting seeing the greater discourse within the occult sphere, but specifically within Thelema and Thelemic communities. It seems like the pendulum swings different ways depending on what era it is. But right now it seems like the popular stance is to have a hard line polytheistic take on the holy books of Thelema. And I've even seen people write on the internet that you can't be an atheist or agnostic into Thelemite, which is just blows my mind. Not saying you have to be, right? There's room for a myriad of different interpretations of divinity, but it's really throwing the baby out with the bathwater in that it's not acknowledging the source of a lot of these ideas of scientific lunanism and doubt and skepticism and free thought, which, as Richard says, is there from the very beginning. So it's really refreshing to open that conversation back up, and take it away from its narrow TikTok, I don't know, Ouroboros thing happening.
Let's talk about that because I think, and let's talk about that in the context of 2024, because I think personally, for me, the idea of scientific illuminism and the aim of religion, the method of science, not the Scientology version, but the aim of religion, the method of science, which Hubbard stole. But this idea of empirical investigation of techniques that people have been using throughout human history to get into bizarre altered states of consciousness and however we want to describe that in a way that normies can understand, we're in a cultural moment where that has a chance to really do a lot of good, and not just do good, that's very vague, but I think there's space to slot that back into the full conversation, because you can see, I mean, Crowley, in a way, I think, was his own greatest marketing friend in saying, calling it Magick, and being such a character, because now we know about him. He would have been forgotten otherwise if he hadn't been so bombastic. But at the same time, it's so easy to lose the core of his ideas, which are not even necessarily spiritual or religious. And this idea of scientific illuminism is, I think, one of the most interesting ideas, or the most interesting trajectories for human thought. And you can see people in the public discourse, and this is not a voucher for these people, but I'm just saying, you can see people in the public discourse like Sam Harris or Jordan Peterson, again, it's not a voucher, where that is clearly missing in the cultural dialogue. And people are kind of grinding on, they're back to new atheism, they're grinding on that, they're grinding, well, maybe religion is okay, but now that's getting wrapped up in kind of right-wing interpretations. And you can see the culture wrestling with that meeting point, as it always has. And I think that, in a lot of ways, Crowley figured this out, and people of his tradition figured this out quite a while ago. And in situating it the way you're talking about as part of the free thought movement or influenced by it, that immediately makes me think of, well, where can these ideas slot back into the mainstream cultural dialogue now? And I think there's space for it.
Actually, funny you should mention that, because another book that I have coming out next fall is from Inner Traditions Press, is going to be called Mind Over Magic. And it's me writing from the perspective as a psychologist, looking back on research, actual peer-reviewed experimental studies, so not like theories that are just abstract, but things that are actually backed up by data, and talking about how studies throughout the history of psychology inform the sorts of things that magicians and witches and pagans and other sorts of occult type people do, not in an effort to kind of reduce it all to saying it's all psychology, but just recognizing that psychology is part of anything that we do. And so kind of saying, what kind of evidence is there to kind of help understand when we're doing these weird experiments to kind of, mess up our state of consciousness, and, what is going on? What are some of the functional things happening, and what are some of the benefits, what are some of the mechanisms that make that happen, and so on. So so maybe that will kind of slot in. We'll see how that book is received.
And the thing I really love about this particular book is Richard has the experience of a practitioner and a scientist and someone with a PhD in psychology and a statistician. And so I never actually mentioned this, but I actually have a background in science as well. I used to do physics.
Awesome.
But that issue aside, but I really appreciate how that has allowed this to explore to the very edges of science. Like, what does science actually say? And it says there's something there. And Richard allows you, the reader, to think how you want to think about that. But he looks at it as unbiased of possible kind of way, and a richness to his perspective on this idea that there is something there is a shared human experience around these different altered states and stuff like that. And I think that's going to be a really cool book. I'm super excited about that one. And I am also in that book. So that'll be fun.
That you said that comes out later this year?
Next fall.
Next fall, okay.
2025.
Awesome. Well, I definitely have to have you back on for that one. But
Love to.
I actually don't know, and I'm really curious. Because I'm off in my own world. I don't really look at the scientific research on magic because for me it's real. That's good enough. But I should know, absolutely. And I've done a lot of research, and I've done a lot of looking at the yoga and meditation literature. But I actually have never looked at the whatever you would call it, the psi research literature. I know Mitch Horowitz has a lot, but what does science say about this stuff? I actually don't know. Like, where's the line now?
Yeah. Well, the thing is, there's not a lot of psychological research that's specifically done on magic per se. For my and the thing is, I guess sort of my villain origin story is that I got into psychology, as an occultist, thinking I want to see what psychology has to say about this, and then I was kind of disappointed to find out that there isn't some theory, again, evidence-based theory that supports this. I mean, of course, there's every occultist's favorite, Carl Jung and his theories, but that kind of falls in that sort of school of thought sort of area where it's a useful paradigm from which to practice psychology, but it's not something that is amenable to scientific research and being falsifiable in the Karl Popper sort of sense.
And it doesn't go far enough for magicians either. It's kind of like this no man's land. It's helpful culturally, but kind of a trap, I think.
Yeah. So, and I guess that's kind of what I was trying to clarify when I said, this book is kind of focusing on actual scientific research, but it took me a long time because I kind of went, well, okay, so it's like I'm here now in this grad school program, and it's not really telling me what I wanted to do. So I'll become a social psychologist, that looks at observable behavior rather than speculating on what's happening inside the mind, since that's something that psychology doesn't seem to be, interested in tackling. But looking back on, on this 30 years later or so, there's nevertheless pieces there. One example that kind of springs immediately to mind is in marketing research. It's been very well demonstrated that people see their possessions as kind of extensions of themselves. And to me, once you start looking at that research, that slots right in with discussion of the magician and their weapons. I mean, the dagger is literally the representation of your intellect. The cup is the representation of the emotions. And so when you're using these magical weapons that's traditional in ceremonial magic, you are symbolically manipulating your states of consciousness, but the research shows that, yes, we do actually perceive our things as extensions of ourselves. So this isn't just, symbolically we're talking here, but this is something that we actually psychologically do. And so for me, it's more pulling together these ideas that kind of connect to things that we do, even though they're not necessarily explicitly about magic. There are studies that talk about, going through moderate trials to join a group, for instance, and that kind of ties into the experience of initiation. But the idea that too severe a trial then crosses into hazing and kind of can create resentment toward the group. Again, these aren't necessarily about occult groups, but that it is about initiation. There is, and a lot of studies on ritual tend to look at also kind of the social aspect of ritual, kind of that it kind of enforces normative behavior, or that people doing like group ritual tend to experience some kind of synchrony, but it's, my focus is more about what's happening to the individual rather than at the kind of the social level.
I'm chuckling because I'm remembering what the cover of the book looks like. It's a lovely cover. They did a great job with it. It's just very much not in line with the contents of the book. I mean, Richard is a serious researcher and a ceremonial magician, and the book cover looks like a pop witchcraft book.
But that's good because I'm trying to actually
Yeah.
I want to reach
Hopefully, it
a
helps.
wider audience. I'm kind of known as the kind of the Thelema Crowley guy, and this is actually I very consciously wrote this saying this applies to whether you're a Thelemite, whether you're a Rosicrucian, whether you're a Wiccan, whether you're a Freemason, whatever. We're all doing these practices, and this applies to anyone who's doing this, regardless of what their specific path
Yeah,
is.
the cover's really cute. I like it. It's just at odds with the content. There's a little bit of tension there, but it's cute. I like it a lot. I like it's
Hopefully,
good.
yeah, hopefully it sells very well.
Yeah, I hope so too.
What would you say your individual experiences have been of the Thelemic world in your time in it and how it's changed, adapted to the culture? Obviously, it's, of course, gone through a lot of upheavals as over the last century, but how have you, it sounds like you're both actively involved. How is it now versus, let's say, 20 years ago, or just in your own, how have you seen it change during your tenure within it?
Oh my gosh, a huge change. I guess I can
Yeah, go
start.
ahead. I've been talking a lot.
Give you a chance to have a drink or something. So, 10, I would say 15, 20 years ago, I would say it's a very different landscape than what it is today. A lot of great, good changes, a lot of positive changes, a lot of not so good changes. 20 years ago, organizations, I would say, like the OTO, but other occult groups that I was marginally involved with, were very male dominated, extremely male dominated. It was a very tough space to be in. Sorry, there's just a lot to unpack there. It's tough for a lot of reasons, and I think now, fast forward 20 years, we are seeing, especially in orders like the OTO, a lot more women in leadership. There was a time on the East Coast that all of the local groups' masters were actually women, and so we're seeing a lot more diversity. And with that diversity comes different, fresh perspectives on things. It's a cool place to be, and also. So that's cool, right? So there's a movement, I would say, towards more diversity in general in our local communities. But I think the downside of one of the trends I'm seeing is with the advent of TikTok and all of these social media platforms, it has really been crystallizing profound amounts of disinformation and also completely wrecking people's attention spans. And I'm seeing people only getting their information from TikTok or Tumblr or Twitter, and they don't read a single book. Whereas back in the day, you had to try really hard to get into this stuff, and not much was on the internet. Actually, I won't get too far into my own story, but one of the reasons I did start to brush shoulders with various occult groups is because I had books, and that's the only way I was able to get access to them. I never joined the groups, but I made lots of friends in them, blah, blah, blah. But now it's like people watch TikTok and like, wow, I know all about Aleister Crowley. And then they pronounce it Crowley. And they come on and they're literally regurgitating satanic panic era stuff, without any critical thought into it. And I mourn the fact that there's not more intellectual curiosity. It seems like a lot of people are so profoundly scared, and so they cling to their TikTok as some sort of like, and social media as well, it's some sort of like dark klepothic thing going on that people cling to like it's a life raft, when in reality it's dragging them further down.
I think in some ways that kind of ties back to, I said it kind of earlier in the talk about how having a nuanced sort of view of things used to be seen as someone who, again, was knowledgeable and respectable and would actually take some time to think about this. But we now live in an era where everyone's expected to have a strong opinion about everything.
Right.
And most people don't really have enough knowledge about many topics to have an opinion about. I certainly don't have enough knowledge about everything in the world to have an opinion about everything. But it seems like this thing that drives social media is having a strong opinion and being very combative about people who have a different opinion. And there is no room anymore for a person who has the nuanced view. It's it's A or B, but nothing in between. One thing, like we get back to your original question about how things have changed over the years. A number of years ago, I was in Austin, Texas for the National Ordo Templi Orientis conference. And in a spare moment there, I actually caught up and had lunch with Don Webb, who is involved with the Temple of Set.
Yeah, by the way, I live in Austin. I've had Don on the podcast. He's very
awesome. And we just kind of sat back and kind of thought about our respective experiences and how our organizations have changed over the years. And it was kind of funny because it was kind of a parallel thing, which makes me think this is just kind of the nature of groups, or maybe the time in which we live rather than of a particular group. But the common experience that we both shared was that, in the early days, everyone was it was just wild, and it was parties and drugs and sex and all this stuff. And now everyone's kind of grown up, they have careers, they're professionals, and now everyone's like very serious and very bookish, and some of that wild stuff has kind of gone off to the side, and we're actually reached a place of more balance, I suppose, of kind of taking the stuff seriously and working at it from that kind of professional angle. And so I thought that was interesting that we both saw that in our respective organizations.
That is interesting. Lynn, you brought up TikTok and disinformation, and I don't think it might slip away because it's increasingly disturbing. I'm from the Web 1.0 generation, so
same.
TikTok. Yeah, so I don't even have TikTok, and
I don't either. So fun fact, so a lot of people on the internet really hate that I exist. They absolutely hate that women talk about Thelema. And I get massive amounts of hate in a way that Richard has never seen in his life, despite him being one of the most public Thelemites alive today. But one of the things a really rude, nasty man said to me is he called me a TikTok witch, which was hilarious to me because I have never been on TikTok and I've never practiced witchcraft. Of course people would play like semantics, but well, actually, technically, if you use a wand, it's witchcraft. It's like, okay, whoa. But the truth is, I just from a categorical standpoint, I've never been in a coven. I don't do what I consider witchcraft. I have been initiated into different ceremonial magic orders. So I've been initiated as a magician several times over. So I consider myself a magician because that's what I am. I think that really speaks to the assumptions we make. It's trying to turn this into a positive spin. I think it really speaks to the assumptions we make about people based on their appearances and how serious their work is or not.
Well, one of the disturbing things about TikTok, not just TikTok, but you mentioned satanic panic, and I've been talking on this podcast for at least 3 years or more, where it seems like so many of the things that were in play during the satanic panic are kind of back. We had the whole we had the QAnon thing, TikTok, you see disinformation being spread on TikTok. I mean, you see people spreading anti-Semitism on TikTok, seemingly unknowingly. It's like all these things that the internet has given us incredible access to information, but it's also revealed a lot of stuff. It's not just revealed stuff that was under the surface, it's allowed, in the case of TikTok, the Chinese government to manipulate it. And that's worrying because I feel that, the type of information that's out about magic on TikTok or YouTube it's just non-information. It's bizarre. And people saying things they shouldn't say, I think. And I worry about that because particularly with the climate in the world right now, it's like it would be quite easy, we have the specter of Christian nationalism coming back in the US, for God's sake.
Hmm.
Um, I feel like that could quite easily turn bad. And so I'm personally, like it's a little worrying because I think as the type of people that we are, we want to share knowledge with everyone.
Yeah.
It's been this kind of golden age for a couple decades where that's been possible, which has been wonderful. There are these undercurrents now, or they're not really undercurrents, they're out in the open that make me a bit more trepidatious. And I'm just because you brought it up, particularly because
Yeah.
I'm curious your thoughts on that.
So I would like to bring up something along this similar current, and it's these occult no read list or witchy no read lists going around where they make lists of books of authors and books you should avoid because they are problematic or toxic. And so typically these lists have it's just like a list of people or books, and then they'll have a really quick one-word reason. And so the one-word reason will be like, appropriation, which of course is an issue, but not many people think about what that actually means, but that's a whole nother conversation. Or they'll put like racism, and then they won't unpack what is actually racist about it.
Mhm.
And I don't want to go down like a conspiratorial rabbit hole, but the thing I want to point out about these lists of books and works coming out, first of all, I would encourage everyone on the planet to put on your free thought helmet and say to yourself, maybe as a mantra, words will not brainwash me. Reading a single book will not convert me. If you accidentally read a book you disagree with, you will not catch fire and go straight to hell. And I think it's actually quite valuable to read things that you disagree with, read things you hate even, if
Mhm.
you can handle it. Now, listen, this is not applying people who are in a psychologically fragile state. Y'all know who you are. If you're working with a therapist, do that. But I'm talking in general here. Yes, it's the internet. So I was like, well, actually, this one circumstance is bad for people. Listen, I'm not talking about that. I'm talking in general. And I think you should put on your armor and you should not approach these works with fear. Approach them with courage and read it and know what you hate. Know who you're canceling, because I've seen these lists, and another troubling thing is the profound amounts of misinformation proliferated on these lists as well. And it's just really interesting to me that the authors on these lists are oftentimes Jewish. And I've noticed a lot of, in particular, queer authors and Jewish authors end up on these lists for reasons like appropriation. And I sit here and I'm like, this author is Jewish writing about Judaism. Why are they on this list? And like I said, I don't want to get conspiratorial, but I want to encourage people to question who is making the list. Yeah, it could have a fun icon on Tumblr or TikTok. It could look like one of your friends. Anyone can make any profile they want. You don't know who's behind it.
Right.
And then really do the deep dive to ask yourself, okay, is this actually what people are saying it is without reading the work? And so I think one of the great antidotes to some of these issues, specifically these lists and like cancellation things going around, is interact with your local community, get to know people in person, and also don't be afraid. Don't be afraid to accidentally come across something you disagree with.
Yeah.
That was one of the beautiful things that came out of my free thought experience. It was putting on in a controlled environment around consensual people, putting on different thoughts, putting on different ideas, and then really stretch those limits so I could know myself and also the world. And it's almost like it's making me immune to other things I may encounter, right? We expose ourselves to ideas so we're not like frightened or like that. I've never spontaneously combusted from reading something I disagree with. And I think it'll be very healthy for people. Be really skeptical of propaganda, and I'll say it, propaganda you find on the internet.
Yeah, I don't think it's a conspiracy theory because we know, and I've just seen them doing it, that online Nazis, neo-Nazis
Yeah.
manipulating other communities.
Hmm.
And they do that intentionally. I think they were doing that before the internet, whether that's entryism or something like that. So
Yeah.
that's not a
And,
conspiracy.
and,
Whether
and
it's
absolutely.
Nazis or someone else, we don't know what's going on. Everything's so confused
Hmm.
now. We have foreign disinformation as well, so it's very hard to understand.
And that's one of the things I've intentionally done with my writing, as well as the communities I foster, as well as my podcast, is if you'll notice, for people who are familiar with my work, there is very intentional diversity, right? I specifically highlight the voices of Jewish people, but also women, but also marginalized people of different classes. And we have discussions. I have on a lot of people that I don't necessarily entirely agree with, but it's a space that's explicitly inclusive. And so it's just really interesting when some of my friends end up on those lists when they're actually very good people.
Yeah, just as a complete aside, and then I'll just a complete tangent, and then I'll come back. One thing that I've been slipping into the podcast here and there is I keep encouraging people to get back into tabletop role-playing games.
Fun.
Well, they're awesome. Second of all, they don't involve phones. Third, they involve interacting with other people. But four, they allow you to take on, like just like you were saying, Lynn, they allow you to take on other ideas, other personalities in a controlled, safe space. And that's what you were saying made me think of.
That's such a good suggestion. I love that.
And I did notice that Chaosium, who publishes my favorite tabletop role-playing game, Call of Cthulhu, later this year is coming out with a book of like one-shot adventures you could play like in an evening. So that one of the things that I've always hesitated with, because I grew up playing D&D and that kind of stuff, but as an adult, one of the things that I've always hesitated about getting back into it is this idea that you've got a group of people who want to meet regularly and do this, and I just kind of like, I don't know if I can commit to regularly doing this. So the idea that, hey, here's some pre-rolled characters, pick one and let's play this adventure and it's done in a night. It's like, yeah, I can do that.
I'm going to give another call to action, and that is spend time with your friends, spend time with your community. I don't care what it is. Go get a cup of coffee, do something low commitment, because the research is coming out more and more that community is vital to us as humans. Yeah. It's good for us psychologically, even physiologically, like, chemically, but also spiritually. And I mean, I've been doing, and I have a friend up in New York who I won't like call out, but she's not originally from the US. And she told me, she's like, Americans suck at having friends.
Yeah.
I really internalized that because she's, and she's like, friends are such a huge part of my culture and where I'm from, and we just suck at it. And she's like, why aren't we regularly checking in with each other? Why aren't we doing stuff together? And I said, you're right. And so I will regularly check in with my friends and set up like coffee dates and stuff. So I just encourage people to like call up your favorite people, let them know you like them, send them an article you thought of them, be like, hey, can we just go get coffee? Can we play, play a video game together? Can we play like a tabletop game together? But those little things are so important. And they're also actively combating this misinformation that's trying to tell us to hate each other.
Right. Well, I think it's I think widely known that the best way to cut through prejudice and hate is just to go meet the type of people that you think you're projecting all this stuff onto, just go meet people.
Yeah.
Realize they're people just like you, it's like, and I that is one of the greatest things about kind of, paramasonic groups. I know Feral House put out a book several years ago. It was the history of, you may know, I can't remember the title. You may remember what I'm talking about. It was a book about Masonic societies in America before the age of TV. And
yeah, I know the book. I can see the cover, like a blue cover with the Heimlich and stuff. Yeah.
But the really interesting thing about it is they were saying it's like before TV, like basically everyone in America was in something like that. They were like an Rotary Club, Freemasons, OTO, right? But like there were these things, these organizations for socializing everywhere. And I think that just exactly what you said, set the occult aside, just hanging out with people who are somewhat similar with similar interests is really healthy, probably, at a cellular level, so that's something that I think that people should really look at again, because some of the most formative experiences in my life were with hanging out with small groups of people in occult orders, and it didn't have to
absolutely
could have been something that it was for me.
Yeah, I'm also, so speaking of related books, there is a well-known book called Bowling Alone that kind of talks about this phenomenon of society becoming more and more insulated and less engagement with civic and other sorts of groups.
Yeah.
Death of the bowling league.
Yeah, I mean, that's a really worrying trend. And I think that's a good
Hmm.
point that Americans suck at friendship. Maybe we just think it gets in the way of work for us or something like that.
Yeah.
Well, this has been a great conversation, but definitely please tell people we've talked about your new projects, but tell people where they can find out more about you and what you're currently working on.
All right, well, I'll start. I am on various social media platforms, Facebook, X, Twitter, Instagram, Threads, Blue Sky. Um, I have some of my so you can follow me and see what I'm up to there. In terms of upcoming projects, I've got the audiobook of Perdurabo coming out at the end of this month. A reissue of the book we talked about earlier, the critical edition of Aleister Crowley's Sword of Song, comes out on April 8th, and then late next year, the Mind Over Magic book comes out. So also my website, Richard-Kaczynski.com, is another way to keep up with what I'm doing. Lynn.
Yeah. First of all, thank you so much for having us on. It
Of
was
course,
really a
thank you
great
for coming. Thank you for
conversation.
coming on.
Um,
Thank you.
Again, my name is Maevius Lynn, and the best place to find some of my lectures, so I give lectures in person and then I translate them into YouTube videos sometimes. If you're interested in seeing like my intro to the Thoth Tarot presentation, bunch of other subjects, those are on my YouTube channel, which is called Maevius Lynn. Also, my podcast is on there where I talk to authors and highlight diverse voices. And share my experience as a Thelemite. As far as I know, I'm the only Thelemite who's vlogging being a Thelemite, like rituals and stuff and experiences. So if you're interested in that, I do a little bit of that too. I'm on social media. Wow. I I'm on Instagram, Threads, X. I'm also on Patreon. If you want to join my book club, you can join my Patreon. Or if you have financial need or some sort of financial issues, just contact me and you can join. It's open to people of all financial backgrounds or circumstances. And then, of course, at the last Mystic South conference, I was included with the Llewellyn authors. So there was no big announcement made yet, but if you're interested in big announcements from me, follow me, and maybe will be one soon.
All right. Well, thank you both for being on and hope to have you back on, of course.
It was a
Wonderful. Thank you
pleasure.
so
Thank you.
much.